I'm going to try to model some things today that, even though we don't necessarily have various disabled people in the audience that are visibly or otherwise identified, we never know these things. So bear with me, because we're all trying to increase access at SPICY. So I'm going to describe some slides that are all about a section of this book that Joan mentioned that is coming out in September, that I've worked for the last 4 years on, Ableism. This work is really designed to review what we currently know in brief about when confrontation is effective, and that is work that comes in Chapter 7. The book is divided into 3 parts, so it talks about the various origins of prejudice against disabled people, regardless of their impairment type, and then gets into some of the effects on people with these experiences, and then how do we change it? How do we advocate what works? And so I just want to focus on the confrontation work because we can all be allies. I'm very honored to be publishing for the SPICY Contemporary Social Issues series, and again, the book is coming out in September. So I have long been fascinated by confrontation. It is certainly the road less traveled, and so I've been interested in trying to get my hands on all possible reviews about the parameters under which speaking out when you hear prejudice, when you see prejudicial actions, and saying something. So that's what we're going to focus on today. This very tiny image here in front of me, I'm going to try to see. So confrontation, the definition here is a voluntary act of expressing disapproval toward those who perpetuate prejudice against others. Instead of just remaining silent, people can directly challenge and rebuke prejudicial comments, and I would also add actions, both verbally in what you say in response, or non-verbally in terms of your expressions or behaviors, and again with the goal of disrupting and reducing future expressions of prejudice. And the quote here says, confrontations require a grassroots endeavor for social change in which any individual person has the potential to influence and improve others and perhaps society in general. There are risks to confronting others and to taking a stand, which requires courage and effort. Some of those risks include the social costs, right? So people recognize that confrontation is less likely when there are high perceived costs, when people are afraid of being embarrassed or ridiculed, ostracized, or even worse, when there is legitimate backlash that could be leveled against the person that stands up and says something. Harm has been known to happen in some cases. And so I have some images on this slide I want to describe. There's an image of a large cat confronting a small mouse to illustrate how confrontation is certainly less likely when you are interacting with a powerful person, perhaps who you are outcome dependent upon. And the other sort of barriers to confrontation may be more benign, but still prevent folks from taking action, and those include maybe this isn't a clear instance of prejudice, maybe the person is just joking, or really this is a culture of privacy, it's none of my business to step in and say anything. Or I think one of the most common reasons people fail to respond is that they feel stymied, and in the moment they just don't know what to say, and later rehearse what they should have said and may berate themselves for not responding. There are, however, benefits without risk. There are no rewards to taking a stand and confronting, and this slide documents the possibilities of leveraging peer pressure to encourage change. Change at the personal level, which would be if you confront someone who then feels a sense of, I hadn't thought about it that way, maybe I should take the perspective of someone outside of my group membership, maybe cultivating empathetic concern or more self-awareness. So personal change is possible. Intergroup change, to the extent that folks then begin to conform to new standards of behavior, and societal change, which includes shifting the actual normative landscape in the long haul. Simply overhearing an anti-racist statement, this is from Blanchard's work, makes white participants in studies condemn racism more than those who didn't hear arguments against racism. And frankly, confrontation, verbal or otherwise, signals the unacceptability of expressions of prejudice. Silence, on the other hand, in response to prejudice, not only implies the acceptability, it ends up empirically increasing the support for prejudice and the prejudiced speaker, as we learned last night at the Staub presentation. So again, encourage folks to consider their silence as an act of just reinforcing the status quo, intentional or not. And in the image in this slide that's appearing in the left are two knight chess pieces, one black, one white, facing off against one another. So what works? In brief, research is now accumulated across several studies that articulates when confrontations are most effective, the parameters. So studies of racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, heterosexism show that confronting prejudice can not only reduce subsequent stereotyping, but more evaluative biases as well, not only among the perpetrators who are confronted, but who are witnesses, those who are simply in the audience to hear the confrontation. And there are many mechanisms that have been tested. I have no new data to share with you today, but among the mechanisms that have been reviewed are the installation of guilt or the arousal of discomfort, which no one seems to like, but it can certainly be productive. Increasing some internal motivation in the perpetrator of the prejudice to avoid future instances of prejudice, and it can also make more non-prejudice norms more salient. People are much more likely, this is sort of intuitive, to confront prejudice when the prejudice is clear, which it often is not. It is often ambiguous. Was that really a microaggression? That seems like a benevolent case of someone trying to help someone else. But when clear expressions of prejudice are put out there, people are much more likely to respond when they're more offensive. People are more likely to respond when they have more contact with outgroups and are committed to equality. And I love this image because this image shows two trees that are sort of in the shape of faces, the branches and the leaves of the trees facing one another, and a cross-understanding is signaled by the birds that are going between the tree heads. Also, I'll read the quote. When people are provided with consensus information that other people hold less prejudiced beliefs than them, they respond by changing their own racial beliefs in the corresponding direction. So for whom does prejudice work? We are still learning what the optimal forms of confrontation look like. Studies are emerging all of the time. But in terms of effectiveness, you can think of effectiveness as operationalized as actually changing behavior, changing attitudes. But another way to operationalize effectiveness is when the confrontation message is accepted as valid and applicable to the self. So in general, people, the research finds, are more receptive to criticism from members of their own in-groups. People are more likely to change their beliefs in response to confronters who are not from the group that is targeted for prejudice, which is another way to say their own in-group. So, for example, studies show that whites who confront racist stereotypes are thought to be more persuasive than blacks who confront racist stereotypes. Males who confront remarks that are seen as sexist are seen as more legitimate than females who stand to benefit from the confrontation. Advantaged group allies, dominant group members, are considered more credible and convincing to their in-groups than disadvantaged members. And again, non-targets, people that are not the targets of prejudice, people who confront seem less self-interested and therefore seem to have more legitimacy. But that's not universally the case. There are studies that show that in-group members themselves from disadvantaged groups that are the targets of prejudice can sometimes be considered more persuasive. And in one particular study by Douglas and Sutton, those with schizophrenia who confronted mental illness bias were actually seen as more legitimate than those without mental illness. So we still have a lot to learn. People are also more receptive to less accusatory, less threatening, less angry responses or low threat confrontations, and by confrontations that emphasize the greater good. How if we could learn to become more mutually understanding, that there are benefits to both groups. I will say, though, that we need more work on when angry, morally outraged responses are effective, because sometimes shame, right, serves an important function, and I think I'm looking forward to getting involved in more of that research myself. So what I want to do next is just share with you some specific examples and maybe make this a little interactive. So this comes from work that was just recently published. This is actually already out in JSI, the articles that both Joan and Kathleen mentioned. The article that I contributed to with my disabled colleagues, Ariel Silverman and Alexia Kemmerling, collected examples from disabled people who experienced sensory, visible, invisible, physical, psychiatric conditions, and we coded those for frequency of occurrence in their lives. And so some of the more pervasive, common things that people hear who are disabled are things like, "I would rather be dead than disabled." Now, this may sound surprising, but it is more common than you realize. Sometimes these comments come from strangers. Sometimes they come from fellow friends and family members. I have a daughter who was born with a physical disability, and a very good friend of mine, to my face, without really thinking anything of it, said, "If I ever become disabled, just shoot me." I didn't know what to say in the moment. People are told all the time, "What's wrong with you? I'm sorry you can't, XYZ. I'm praying for you to be cured." And then when a disabled person is traveling with a companion, often people will assume that that companion speaks for them, and perhaps due to lack of familiarity, they will turn to the companion and say, you know, "Can he eat by himself?" Or there are other examples of things that are said to people when they experience a disabled person in a non-expected role. "You work? Well, isn't that cute?" These are all real quotes, by the way, that people have said really over and over. "She's so pretty, it's such a shame she has the disability." Another one that's very common, it's hard to believe that this would be as common as it is, but for those with visibly identifiable conditions, they're often asked by complete strangers, "Can you have sex? How does that work?" You know, as if it's the visibility of the disability gives people the right to ask those questions, or at least they think it does. "No, here, let me help you." This is often something that friends and family do because things take longer sometimes when they're on crib time. Or if you use a mobility device, another common thing people will say. And I think in some cases this is meant to be a form of, "I want to get to know you, I want to get engaged with you, I'm trying to be funny. Slow down, speed racer." Or the ever popular and increasingly salient inspiration porn. That is a new term for some people, but it is a term that is in desperate need of study, a phenomena where people are told that they are inspiring simply for getting out of the house. So if you want to see these in action, there's actually a whole set of internet videos by disabled people, sometimes by non-disabled people, called "Shit People Say to Disabled People." I put an example of a woman who not only gives examples of these, but also examples of how to confront them. Her name is Christina Lake, and so I encourage you to check those out. And what I want to do next is just ask you to maybe share what you might say. What might you do if you are in the presence of someone, or perhaps you yourself experience an impairment, and you are told any one of these things. So I'm just going to call some out, and then I'm going to share some things that I sort of came up with in communication with others, but may not be the best responses. So I don't know, anyone have a really good comeback confrontation for I'd rather be dead than disabled?
You might deserve it.
Oh, that's good. There's a real place for sarcasm. So Chris Crandall said to say, you might deserve it. What's wrong with you?
What's wrong with you?
That's a great one. My daughter loves that one.
I love The Bachelor. That's what's wrong with me. Or, it's not, I don't know.
I love The Bachelor. She's so pretty, it's such a shame.
Why?
Mm-hmm. Sometimes the simple response of, why would you say that, at least puts the onus on the perpetrator to begin to think about why they said that. Can you have sex?
Not with you.
Not with you! That's good.
My husband likes to say, you're really bad at flirting.
Slow down, Speed Racer. So my response to that is, what are you, the mobility police? And how about this one too? I mean, people really genuinely seem to experience, at least in their own minds, a sense of inspiration when they see someone, perhaps because of low stereotypical expectations, out in public, having lunch, working, taking public transportation, and this is a very understudied phenomenon. Like, are they experiencing inspiration? And if so, what are they inspired to do? Or is this just sort of a paternalistic response? But any thoughts about what to say when people say, you are so inspiring?
I'm just doing what everybody else is doing. Kind of like normalizing it, like I'm just here.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I like that. You know, why is this special? It's, you do the same thing. So you can sort of see, if you are able to see the slides here, some possible responses. Just why do you say that? Disabled people would disagree that it's better to be dead than disabled. Can he do that for himself? Why don't you ask him? What's that next one? Oh, she's so pretty, it's such a shame. I know plenty of ugly non-disabled people. And there are others. The last one, in response to that, you're so inspiring, comes from one of our participants, and she actually confronts people by saying, what is it that I inspire you to do? Reduce ableism? And that can sometimes open up a conversation. The image you see on this slide is from an organization called DAPT. They are very much interested in increasing access to home care, personal care services outside of institutions. And it's an image of a wheelchair symbol sort of in chains by the hands, but breaking those chains. So just a couple other slides here. With respect to non-disabled allies, we all have the potential, obviously, to become allies for one another, and yet there is no research to date on confrontations by non-disabled allies in response to ableism or disability prejudice that I know of, although it may be in the works. I want to thank these colleagues, though, because we do know some things about non-disabled allies of disabled people, and some of those things include what my colleague Carol Gill found, that non-disabled allies are people that not only recognize ableism, but despise it when they see it. And from the broader literature on allies who choose to confront tend to be more optimistic people, tend to be more communal, more activist identified, and if they are within the target group, they are more group identified. There are some national campaigns designed to confront ableism that you may have heard of. One is called Spread the Word to End the Word, in response to, they call it the R word, which has come to mean globally uncool or ignorant. And this intervention has made traction. We've done some studies evaluating the impact pre and post, folks being educated about this. And for folks that are curious about the hashtag Say the Word, which sort of plays off the spread the word to end the word, this is an idea started by Lawrence Carter Long, that people shouldn't be afraid to say the word disabled. It's how many people identify with identity first language. And then there's another image in the corner, a group that labels themselves not dead yet, in large response to this pervasive perception that disability is a fate worse than death. And they've worked to advocate for recognition that disabled lives are valuable and should not be subject to euthanasia, assisted suicide, and so forth. So next steps and future directions. Those that I'm interested in most would be how do we begin to recruit dominant group allies who can influence their peer networks? How do we foster recognition of discrimination? So there's a whole literature on whether or not people even recognize what is discriminatory and what is not. Is that ableist? Is it not? Chris Crandall has a famous chapter that talks all about the normative window, and in times of change, this normative window, people get really confused about what constitutes prejudice and what does not. But it really provides, the window that has been opened provides an opportunity for people to take more action, to make visible what people are unclear about, and can leverage collective action among disabled people themselves to want to get more involved in these kinds of activities. The other piece of research that I've had my students involved in is, and this is in the classroom, is practicing. Practice makes perfect. And you can read up on the effective use of practicing confrontations. Scott Klaus and also Lawson and colleagues have had students collect examples for a week of different forms of prejudicial expressions, and then they read some of the research on what is a more effective form of confrontation, practiced, and then were much more likely to utilize those forms in the future because they felt equipped. Some examples you all gave already were just, I'm surprised to hear you say that, because I've always thought of you as someone who's very open-minded. Or, excuse me, what did you say? Why did you say that? And I just want to sort of end by giving one more quote here. Norms do change over time as part of the results, in part as the result of successive challenges which produce new balances of power reflected in new structures of rules. So, final slide here is just to encourage you all to practice. This sort of implies classroom-related things that we can do. I'm grateful to Brooke Vick, who does lots of great consultation on how to do some of this, and I'm often referring to it because I'm still learning myself how to navigate difficult conversations in the classroom. But the notion is to resolve not to take the easy way out, to listen when you hear a student respond, perhaps in a way that they don't intend. Often this is unintentional. You may just affect a surprised expression or act confused by why someone might say what they said. You can mirror the response back to them, which gives you some time to sort of gather yourself, or restate their comment in a slightly different way. Ask follow-up questions, arouse self-reflection, require students to do self-reflections, create dissonance by reminding perpetrators that they are not this way in other contexts, and sort of get them thinking about that. And then finally, do the confrontation. Consider whether you should do it respectfully or whether you should do it in a more angry way. And I think sometimes that can be quite effective too. So I want to thank everyone for listening. Here's a cover of the book. You can see a woman emerging from constraints, this wall of maze that sort of reflects for me this idea that ableism still exists, but progress has been made. And I want to thank again my student and other collaborators, and please get in touch if you would like more information. Thank you.